Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a breaking news update for the Ukraine war and the UK political scene as well, because I'm going to talk to you about the former Welsh leader for Reform UK, or leader for Reform UK in Wales, having been jailed for 10.5 years for taking Russian bribes. But actually, that's not the breaking news that came out earlier today. It's what the Prime Minister has said in response to this in the UK. And I think it's absolutely on point. It's absolutely right. And we're going to get into it in just a second. But before we do so, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. It really helps out the channel. So thank you for those who have already done so. Okay, let's get into it then. Now, we have, as mentioned, the news that the former Welsh Reform leader has been jailed for pro-Russian bribery. I'm not going to go into the details of this story other than to say that he took bribes on behalf of Russia, and he has now been jailed. He will be jailed. The sentencing came through today for 10.5 years. So this is really serious. And the first thing to say, I guess, in this whole narrative of the video is that I think the British justice system has come up with the goods here, and this is a very serious offence being treated in the manner with which it deserves. Okay, so that's really good news. Robust response to what is effectively treason here. Okay. Now, the next thing I'm going to say, and I'm not going to play these videos. I've done so for you before, but the activity that Nathan Gill committed to that has ended up with him going to prison, taking bribes from pro-Russian people to say certain things in public, as a member of European Parliament for the Brexit Party, and previously the UKIP. So it was UKIP, then Brexit Party, then Reform. All of these were Nigel Farage parties. Now, when he was in Brussels in the European Parliament, he was saying these things because he was paid to say them. And these things were typical pro-Russian narrative talking points. Now, at the same time that Nathan Gill was saying these things because he was paid to say them, Nigel Farage is on record, as you can see from these two videos. I'm not going to play them to you because that's another 5 minutes. But Nigel Farage says exactly the same things at exactly the same time, in exactly the same circumstances, same context, same location. Nigel Farage says them too. So the question is, if Nathan Gill said them because he was being paid and has ended up going to prison on account of saying those things because he was paid to say them, what does it say about Nigel Farage, who has said exactly the same things in exactly the same places? Surely it warrants Farage being investigated, because either he's saying pretty treacherous things off his own back. Okay, freedom of speech, he's entitled to say those things, I guess. But if we've just sentenced this guy, Nathan Gill, for 10.5 years for saying these things, surely it warrants investigation, especially since there are other pieces of circumstantial evidence that would suggest that Nigel Farage is very much attuned to the Russian narrative. He appeared on Russia Today some 17 plus times. We don't know how much money he took for that. We also understand that he was in negotiations to have his own show on Russia Today, which was a Russian state broadcasting propaganda network. And there are all these other connections to Russia through, say, Leave.eu, the movement to leave the EU for the Brexit campaign. Aaron Banks was a big funder of that. He met the Russian ambassador a number of times, lied about it. Subsequently, it came out that he did meet the Russian ambassador more than he even admitted to later, and that there were claims about money changing hands there. And so there are lots of reasons, I think, that indicate that Nigel Farage should be investigated. Just as Nick Reeves here says, here on Farage and Gill parroting the same Russian propaganda lies in the European Parliament on September the 16th, 2014. So the same day. The hesitant manner in which Gill reads his speech suggests that he's just been handed it. If that's the case, who wrote it and who gave it to him? The Russians or Farage? And why are both of them parroting Russian propaganda? Okay, so now what we understand, this is the main crux of the video that I'm giving to you now, is that Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, has demanded an investigation into reform, into the reform Russia links after the party's ex-Wales leader was jailed. The former leader of reform in Wales, Nathan Gill, was jailed for 10.5 years after being paid £40,000 to make pro-Russian statements in the European Parliament. This is Keir Starmer earlier today.
I asked you at party conference what you thought about Nigel Farage. You said he was formidable. Now you're saying he's spineless. Why? What's going on, and what do you think about the reform development with Nathan Gill?
Well, I'll point to two things there. First, he's had a fellow MP in Reform who said, I think she said, that she's fed up with seeing black and Asian faces on the television. That's shocking. That's racist. And Nigel Farage hasn't got the spine to do anything about it. And then today, we see the sentencing of the ex-leader in Wales of Reform for pro-Russian bribery, undermining our country. So Nigel Farage, he often has a lot to say. What he needs to do is to launch an investigation into his party, to understand how that happened. This is a serious sentence that's been imposed today, over 10 years. It's a very serious issue. How did that happen, that this was happening in his party? And what other links are there between Reform and Russia? And that would be the mark of a leader, and that's what he should do.
Do you think Nigel Farage is racist? We've had this conversation, and you wouldn't go there, will you now?
Well, I think that what he should do, when he can see what to me is clear racism, a fellow MP saying, I'm fed up with black and Asian faces on my television. That to me is racism. I suspect it is for most people watching this, but he hasn't got the spine to call it out. He's got plenty to say about plenty of things, but when it comes to the fundamentals, he can't call it out. And now he needs to deal with this pro-Russian bribery. It's not just a serious criminal offence, it undermines our country. It's serious. The first duty of a Prime Minister, of a leader, is to keep our country safe. So he needs to launch that investigation.
Now, this is great from Keir Starmer. I like to see this being at the forefront of the mainstream media. And many of us have been calling out for this previously with regard to Nathan Gill and the connections that reform has to Russia, or potentially has to Russia. However, criticism of Starmer here is he's calling for Nigel Farage to investigate his own party's connections. No, what really needs to happen is that Nigel Farage needs to be investigated himself by third parties. Nigel Farage is never going to admit to, oh yeah, I've just investigated myself. It turns out that, yeah, I've got loads of connections to Russia. I'm going to hand myself into the nearest police station. Sorry about that. Yeah, that's my fault. However, it is great to see this being front and center of the mainstream media news programs today. We've been calling for this to be much more reported on. You have people like the Byline Times doing a really good job, Peter Jukes there, of reporting on reform's connections to Russia. And now we've got Sky News bringing it up with Keir Starmer. But Keir Starmer, as much as I agree with what he said there, he didn't go far enough. I think there needs to be an investigation into Nigel Farage himself. Responding to the sentencing, says Sky News, a Reform spokesman said, Mr. Gill's actions were reprehensible, treasonous and unforgivable. We are glad that justice has been served and fully welcome the sentence Nathan Gill has received. End quote. Police have confirmed Mr. Farage has not been part of the investigation. That's the key. He needs to be part of the investigation. Mr. Farage said on Friday, quote, an investigation into Russian and Chinese influence over British politics would be welcome. Okay, well, let's do that. Let's publish the report that hasn't been published about Russian interference in the Brexit election. Wonder why that wasn't published, because actually it would have been embarrassing for the then Conservative government, because it's clear that there was Russian interference. The Reform UK MP for Clacton, that's Nigel Farage, had previously described his former colleague as a bad apple and said he was shocked after Gill pleaded guilty to bribery. Shocked, even though Farage has been saying exactly the same things as Gill. Farage said, any political party can find in their midst all sorts of terrible people. You can never, ever guarantee 100% that everyone you meet in your life you shake hands with in the pub is a good person. Of course, Gill isn't someone he just shook hands with. Gill is someone he took from UKIP to the Brexit Party to Reform, and that he put in charge of the whole of Wales for Reform. And in fact, he did have a close working relationship with, even though he initially tried to deny it. Sentencing Gill, Justice Chima Grubbs said that he had allowed money to corrupt his moral compass in a grave betrayal of the trust vested in you by the electorate. At that time, the offences, Gill was a member of the European Parliament, having been originally elected for UKIP. So on and so forth. So, yeah, good that this is out there in a big way, but I think there needs to be a formal investigation. Now, this is Alistair Cairns, an MP, also an Armed Forces Minister, so a Labour MP and veteran.
Well, I've been in the Marines for 24 years, and to find out that someone has taken money from Russia, I think it's an absolute disgrace. You know, the reality is we have a war on the edge of Europe causing thousands of casualties a day, and then we find out that part of Reform, an individual in Reform, is taking bribes from the Russian state. And then even worse than that, years ago, Nigel Farage has mentioned that Vladimir Putin is an individual he admires. I mean, this is a time for serious government. We've got serious risks to the country. We've seen the Yantar just up north of our coast just recently, and we've got to have serious politics. To find out someone is taking bribes from the Russian state is it's despicable. And I genuinely believe that we need Reform to conduct a full investigation to weed out any Russian influence whatsoever in the party.
Now, yes, that needs to happen, but as I've said, that won't go nearly far enough. They're not going to self-police themselves to the point where any heat is going to be put on Nigel Farage. The problem is, although I really would want an investigation into Reform would just say, look, we're being victimized by the government at the moment to stop us getting to power, blah, 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 and they play the victim card. But I just still think it has to happen. Now, it's interesting today that GB News, and remember, Nigel Farage has shares in GB News. He has a show on GB News. He's not being regulated effectively enough by Ofcom, our communications regulator in the UK, because he shouldn't be able to have, as a leader of a political party, a news show. And so they get away with it by saying, hey, it's not a news show, it's just an opinion show on a news channel where he talks about news. Okay, right. So anyway, you've got to understand where GB News come from. They are just a massive advocate for and amplifier of Reform UK. They are Reform UK's megaphone in the media space. So GB News has pumped out over 100 tweets today. Absolutely nothing about Nathan Gill. No surprise, considering Nigel Farage is a shareholder. If anything, it goes to show it's one big propaganda machine for Reform, if we didn't know that already. And yeah, well said there. It's also worth noting that this news piece has come out today as well. Cryptocurrency backed by Farage donor is used for Russian war effort, according to investigators. Tether tokens found to facilitate scheme that enables sanctions evasion and launders money for the Kremlin. And that is one of Nigel Farage's biggest donors. Has been used, cryptocurrency backed by one of his biggest donors, has been used to help Russia fight its war against Ukraine, according to the National Crime Agency, which spent 4 years trying to crack a multi-billion-dollar scheme that exchanges cash from drug and gun sales in the UK for crypto digital tokens that are designed to hide their users' identities. The scheme has enabled, quote, sanctions evasions and the highest levels of organized crime, including providing money laundering services for the Russian state, says the agency. Of the $24 million in crypto that the NCA and its counterparts abroad have so far been able to seize, the vast majority was issued by Tether, private company headquartered in El Salvador. Tether has grown so popular that it declared profits of $13 billion for 2024, 1.5 times those of McDonald's. Tether's shares are reportedly owned by a small group, among them Christopher Harborne, one of the UK's biggest political donors. Harborne took a 12% stake around 2016, court papers say, although it is unclear what share of Tether profits he has received. In 2019 to 2020, as the UK was leaving the EU, Harborne gave £10 million to Nigel Farage's Brexit party, since renamed Reform UK. In January, Farage accepted another £28,000 from Harborne to attend Donald Trump's inauguration as president, the month after the US placed sanctions on the Russian bosses of the laundering networks that publicly warned they were using Tether. Reform UK, first British political party to accept donations in crypto, did not respond to a request for comment, surprisingly. Harborne's lawyers said that accusing an investor in Tether of complicity in crimes perpetrated by users of its tokens would be akin to claiming the US Treasury is an accomplice to money laundering because it prints the US dollar. So on and so forth. So, you can, and there's much more to be said about that. But there are all sorts of accusations flying around at the moment, and I think there are enough connections now with reform. Sorry, I wasn't sharing this Guardian article with you. My bad. But there are enough, I think, connections between Reform UK and Russia to warrant an investigation. I think there does need to be a formal investigation. I would have thought that our secret services would have some idea about what's going on, though. But anyway, what do I know? I just think that there are too many dodgy connections that are out there in the public information spaces, that there must be more underneath. It must be the tip of the iceberg, and more needs to be done. Anyway, I thought I would share that with you, that Starmer is calling on an investigation. Unfortunately, it is not a third-party investigation, but he's calling on Farage to investigate his own party over their connections to Russia. But you can bet your bottom dollar now, and we've seen this from Zach Plansky with the Green Party, which is becoming the left-wing populist response to the right-wing populism of Farage and Reform UK. He is often using Russia as a stick with which to beat Farage, and I think you're going to hear that a lot more from Labour, and possibly if the Conservatives decide to go hard on Farage as well for their own politicking reasons, you might see Russia be one of the prime arguments against Farage and Reform. Anyway, that's enough for me. Thank you. Take care. Speak to you soon.